discovering the foul stench at a New York apartment complex. It was a quiet and humid Wednesday morning in mid-June, as the residents of Greenpoint Towers in Brooklyn went about their routines. The 12-story building was a mix of eclectic families, young professionals chasing dreams, and retirees reliving quieter lives in the cacophony of New York City. But that morning, something felt off. Mrs. Felicity Jones, a retired schoolteacher living on the 8th floor, was the first to notice it, a faint, unpleasant odor wafting through the air as she stepped into the hallway. Like something rotting, she muttered to herself. She bent down near her doorframe, thinking some old food had been left at her doorstep by a neighbor's careless kid. Still, nothing unusual appeared. Shrugging it off, she closed her apartment door and reached for her morning tea. By the following day, the smell had grown more intense. Ping Zhao, a tech worker 2 doors down, wrinkled his nose as he returned home late that evening. He texted a friend, "Man, something reeks on my floor, smells like a dumpster exploded, weird, right?" Other residents began noticing too. Pets that were usually calm and lethargic began growling or scratching at doors. Air fresheners and candles were lit in futile attempts to mask it. Whispers buzzed in the elevators. "Is it the trash chute?" someone asked. "Maybe a broken pipe?" Others raised eyebrows, joking morbidly, "You don't think it's," before waving the thought away. On Friday morning, the building superintendent, Mr. Gary Feldman, was bombarded with calls. Yeah, I'm looking into it," he groaned, his gravelly voice echoing frustration as he lugged his toolbox toward the trash disposal room. Still, the room didn't reveal anything obvious. A quick inspection revealed overflowing trash bags, nothing beyond normal. Residents on the 8th floor, however, were now convinced the stench was concentrated near apartment 8B. That unit belonged to Jake Ford. "You remember him, don't you?" Felicity whispered to her neighbor, Mrs. Kalinsky. "Tall guy, bit scruffy, lives alone, always polite when I see him, but I haven't in, a week, maybe more." Kalinsky nodded. "Probably on vacation or something, or maybe forgot to pay his bills again," she replied, but the discomfort never left her voice. It wasn't until Ping, on his way to work Friday morning, noticed something alarming. Flies. Dozens of them swarming around the bottom of Jake Ford's apartment door. He stepped back instinctively, his stomach sinking. Ping did what New Yorkers rarely do. He knocked. "Jake?" he called, knuckles rapping on the wooden door, already sticky from the summer humidity. "Hey man, your trash smells like roadkill. Jake, you in there?" But his voice was met with silence. And that silence, it felt too loud. Unsettled, Ping reached out to the superintendent again. This time Feldman didn't hesitate. By 10 a.m., he found himself clutching his master key, standing with 3 concerned residents in the hallway outside apartment 8B. Kalinsky crossed her arms, eyebrows arched in unease. Felicity fanned herself dramatically, muttering, "Something feels wrong, just wrong." When Feldman opened the door, they were hit by the full force of the smell. He staggered back instantly, pressing the collar of his shirt to his face. A gut-twisting mixture of garbage and decay permeated the room. Flies swarmed aggressively around the living room. Feldman called out into the darkness, "Jake, you home?" There was no joking now. Something terrible was clearly wrong. What they found upon entering the apartment would rattle not just the residents of Greenpoint Towers, but the entire city. The haunting scene. Inside apartment 8B. When Gary Feldman, the superintendent, pushed the door open, reality hit like a freight train. He doubled back immediately, clutching his face with his sleeve as if the cotton could shield him from the rancid nightmare filling the air. "Jesus Christ, what is that?" Ping gasped, stumbling backward, one hand clinging to the wall for support. He gagged but managed to hold it in. The others weren't so lucky. Mrs. Kalinsky turned pale, covering her mouth with a shaking hand, while Felicity let her fan clatter to the floor as she fumbled for her handkerchief, tears springing to her eyes from the sheer intensity of the odor. "Stay back! Just, everyone stay back!" Feldman shouted, his voice muffled but trembling with authority he didn't really feel. He leaned into the doorframe again, squinting into the darkness. The air felt thick inside apartment 8B as though it resisted their intrusion. The windows were closed, locking in the heat of summer along with something far worse. The overhead light flickered dimly as Feldman fumbled for the wall switch. "Jake?" he called out, his voice brittle as if expecting an answer but praying there wouldn't be one. The living room was a sprawling mess. Trash, fast food wrappers, empty soda cans, stacks of old newspapers littered the floor. The couch, in better days a dark brown faux leather, was now streaked with sticky dark stains that nobody wanted to identify. On the coffee table a half-drunken soda sat stagnant. its surface shimmering with a thin layer of flies. "He lived like this?" Kalinsky whispered, her voice wobbling between animosity and pity. "No, no," murmured Felicity, her eyes darting nervously over the mess. "This isn't how men live. This is something else." "Is that blood?" Ping's question was more rhetorical than anything, his trembling finger pointing toward a brownish-red smear trailing from the couch toward the hallway. Gary hesitated. He didn't want to follow that trail. Every fiber of his being screamed for him to turn tail and close the door without looking back. But duty, or perhaps morbid curiosity, pushed him forward. The floor creaked under his weight with each hesitant step. The hallway seemed to stretch endlessly. He reached a doorway, the hinges old and rusty. With a shaking hand he nudged it open. "What do you see?" Kalinsky shouted from behind him. She hadn't moved a step closer. Kitchen?" Gary replied, his voice far away, as though he were speaking through static. Felicity, unable to stand the suspense, nudged Ping back. "We can't let him in there alone. What if what?" Ping interrupted, exasperated. "Whatever's in there doesn't want company." But their bickering halted when they heard Gary's panicked cry. "Oh my God!" His voice cracked like dry wood. "Oh dear God! Call 911, now!" The kitchen was cramped and filthy. Dishes were stacked precariously high in the sink, many covered in mold. A pot on the stove held a stagnant pool of blackened water, and an unholy cloud of flies buzzed around the countertop. But the worst part, what made Gary stumble backward and nearly lose his balance, was the object sitting in the middle of the kitchen floor. It was a sizable steel drum, the kind you'd see in industrial storage or construction sites. The lid, bolted tightly shut, was streaked with dried rust, or was it something else? Around its base a puddle of dark, syrupy liquid had formed, oozing out lazily. "What the hell is that?" Ping asked, his voice sharp and urgent as he joined Gary at the door. Gary couldn't respond right away. He pointed shakily at the drum. "That thing, it smells like... His voice trailed off, unwilling to say it. Ping took a step closer but recoiled almost instantly when the smell, thick, suffocating and nauseating, hit him full force. It was beyond the smell of trash or decay. It was the smell of death, unmistakable and ancient. Felicity, still near the hallway, gasped as she covered her chest with trembling hands. "Jake," she murmured, almost praying the name. Gary turned to Ping. "We can't open it," he said, his face pale and drawn. "We can't. This is a crime scene now." "But what if he's in there?" Ping asked, horror evident in his voice. Gary didn't have an answer. The two men stood there, frozen between action and dread, until the sound of sirens swelled in the distance. By the time the police arrived, the scene added another layer of surrealism. Yellow tape cordoned off the apartment as neighbors crowded the hallways, whispering and speculating nervously. 2 uniformed officers entered first, followed by 3 detectives and a forensics specialist. One of the detectives, a wiry man with a no-nonsense demeanor, scanned the room with a grim face before focusing on the steel drum. "Is it locked?" he asked Gary. I think the lid's just bolted shut. I don't know," Gary stammered. The specialist, clad in gloves and a protective mask, approached the drum methodically. He knelt, examining the streaks along its surface. "What is it?" Felicity asked faintly from the hallway. "Do you know what's in there?" The detective shot her a sharp glance but said nothing. Instead, he signaled to the specialist to proceed. The room went silent, the tension mounting unbearably. As the lid was pried open, an audible gasp rippled through the officers standing nearby. In perfect, gruesome concert, the scent of rot and chemicals surged forward, confirming what everyone had already feared. Inside, disjointed shapes began to come into view, pale and waxy under the fluorescence. A sickening layer of corrupted flesh sat in a salty brine. The atmosphere in the cramped kitchen turned icy, despite the summer heat. The detective stood there wordlessly, his brow furrowing deeper with every passing second. Finally, he turned to Gary and spoke solemnly. "You found yourself a goddamn murder scene," he murmured, shaking his head gravely. Identifying the victim. By early afternoon, the NYPD forensics team had fully cordoned off apartment 8B. The once bustling hallway of neighbors had morphed into a hushed corridor of uneasy whispers and concerned faces. But behind the closed doors of the now sealed apartment, a grim operation was underway. Detective Michael Drake, known for his sharp instincts and no-nonsense approach, stood in the living room, his gloved hands crossed tightly against his chest. "All right," he said sternly to the officer nearest him. "Let's start with the tenant records. Who officially lives here?" Officer Melissa Carter, hunched over her notepad, flipped through pages of hastily gathered information. This apartment's leased to a Jake Ford, 38 years old, lives alone. Or at least he's listed as living alone. Lease started about 3 years back. Neighbors said he worked as a freelance graphic designer. Quiet guy, keeps to himself. Drake nodded, tracing his finger along the stained coffee table absent-mindedly. Quiet guy, huh? Doesn't look like it from the state of this place, he muttered under his breath. His eyes darted to the overturned chair in the corner, and then to the trail of discoloration leading to the kitchen. So, no family listed? No emergency contacts? He asked, raising an eyebrow. Melissa frowned, flipping through the papers again. Nope, no spouse or kids noted in the file either. If he had anyone close, he didn't put them on the lease. Drake scratched his chin. All right, but people don't just vanish into thin air. Someone out there knows him. Run his name through the system. Check for priors, open cases, hell, even traffic violations. I want to know who we're dealing with. Meanwhile, Officer Carter's partner Brian Jensen had begun speaking to the neighbors, many of whom still lingered in the hallway despite being told to disperse. Did anyone here know Jake well? Brian asked, looking around at the small circle of uneasy faces. Mrs. Kalinsky, standing with her arms crossed, shrugged. Honestly, not really. Just saw him in passing. He'd carry these big boxes now and then, probably for his work, always polite, I guess. She paused, squinting as she thought. But now that I think of it, I haven't seen him in over a week. Maybe more. Ping, who had stayed behind after his call to 911, chimed in. He wasn't really social. I mean, I'd nod to him occasionally in the hallway. Sometimes I'd hear music coming from here, late night stuff, but it wasn't obnoxious or anything. He hesitated, looking down the hall toward the apartment door. Actually, he added nervously, now that you mention it, there was a woman I'd see coming and going sometimes. Blonde, kind of tall. She had a kid with her, a little girl, maybe 5 or 6. I think she was staying with him. Brian perked up at this detail. A woman and a child? Recently? Ping nodded quickly. Yeah, I mean, I don't know anything about them besides that. They didn't really talk to anyone in the building. She'd usually keep her head down, and the kid was quiet too. Back inside the apartment, the forensics team worked methodically in the kitchen, focusing on the grim contents of the steel drum. Detective Drake stood over Sergeant Laura Matthews as she carefully sifted through the putrid remains. What can you tell me, Laura? Drake asked. Matthews exhaled sharply, pulling off her goggles for a second to rub her temples. Well, it's definitely a male victim, she began, her voice flat and professional despite the horror of what she was describing. From the preliminary examination, I'd guess late 30s to early 40s, and judging by the state of the remains, he's been dead for about 6 to 8 days. The salt, she hesitated, glancing at the layers of crusted brine still clinging to parts of the body. The salt was clearly used to slow decomposition. Whoever did this, they knew what they were doing. Drake's lips tightened. Jake Ford? Matthews shrugged, reaching for a clipboard to take notes. Too early to confirm that, but the odds are looking pretty solid. We'll need dental records or fingerprints to be 100% certain. Drake nodded grimly. Let's not assume anything just yet. The neighbors mentioned a woman staying with him, maybe the kid's mom. If she's missing too, we've got a whole other can of worms here. Less than an hour later, back at precinct headquarters, Melissa burst into the bullpen with new intel. Jake Ford has no criminal record or anything that stands out in his background, she announced, dropping a slim manila folder onto the desk in front of Drake. But something interesting popped up when we searched his recent activity. Drake scanned the contents of the folder, his eyes narrowing as he stopped on a series of bank transactions from the previous month. What's this? He asked, holding up a highlighted page. A withdrawal for $5,000 in cash 2 weeks ago? That doesn't sound like a quiet freelancer's normal routine. Exactly, Melissa agreed. We couldn't find any reason for it, no major purchases, no debts being paid off. He just withdrew it and… poof! This doesn't feel random, Drake muttered, rubbing his temples. Something's missing here. Run checks on that woman Ping saw, the blonde with the kid. If Jake's the victim, she might be the lead, or the suspect. Either way, I want her found. Behind him, an officer rushed up holding a single bagged item. Sir, we managed to find what looks like a wallet near the kitchen trash can. It's got Jake Ford's ID. Drake nodded, grim but unsurprised. All right, looks like we've got our victim, he said, slapping the table with a grim finality. Now let's figure out who wanted him dead and why. Testimonies from the neighbors. The hum of police radios echoed faintly in the hallway, mingling with the low, nervous murmurs of the residents who had gathered nearby. Nobody wanted to linger, yet none could bring themselves to leave entirely. The discovery in apartment 8B had rocked the quiet building, and now the questions were piling up faster than answers. Officer Brian Jensen stepped into the hallway, clipboard in hand, and adjusted his NYPD ball cap. His partner, Melissa Carter, was already working one of the tight-lipped tenants on the far end of the corridor. Jensen cleared his throat loudly, trying to draw the attention of the small group lingering suspiciously near the elevators. "All right, folks, let's cut the whispering," he called, his broad shoulders straightening as he tapped his pen against the clipboard. "If any of you know something, anything about the guy in 8B, now's the time to speak up." Mrs. Kalinsky, an older woman in her mid-60s with a sharp tongue and a habit of knowing everyone's business, crossed her arms over her checkered cardigan. "Jake Ford? I had a feeling something weird was going on with him," she declared, her Brooklyn-accented voice carrying down the hall. "You don't just not take out your trash for weeks like that unless something's wrong." Brian raised an eyebrow. "So you're saying you noticed the smell earlier?" "Well, we all noticed," she replied, gesturing dramatically to the group of tenants as if daring them to disagree. "Mrs. Jones, Ping, everybody, we just didn't know it was—" She paused, lowering her voice. "That bad, you know. But on top of the smell, he was acting strange lately." Jensen leaned forward now, his notepad poised. "Strange how? Can you give me specifics?" Kalinsky lowered her voice, though her eyes darted excitedly as if relishing the spotlight. "He stopped talking to people, for one thing. Used to at least say hello or hold the door. Last couple of months? Nothing. He'd be carrying these boxes in and out at weird hours too, late at night mostly. Big boxes. Like almost as tall as me." She chuckled nervously. "I told my daughter once. He must be running some shady eBay business or something. The way he's going." "I mean, who does that?" Brian scribbled something onto his pad, nodding slowly. "And the smell you mentioned earlier, when did you first notice it?" Kalinsky thought hard, scratching the side of her silver-dyed hair. "A few days ago, maybe Monday or so. But I figured it was just the trash chute backing up. That thing always stinks when Feldman doesn't clean it right." Ping Zhao, standing a few feet away from Kalinsky and looking uncharacteristically somber, interjected. "It wasn't just the trash chute. The scent, it moved. One day it was faint, 2 doors down, then it was like it hit you in the face outside Jake's place. Especially the flies. Flies everywhere. It was disgusting." The officer shifted toward Ping now, nodding for him to continue. "Did you, see or hear anything inside the apartment, maybe in the past week? Did Jake seem to have visitors?" Ping hesitated, glancing uneasily toward Kalinsky, then looked down at the floor as though retracing the week in his head. "Well, there's one thing I noticed," he admitted finally, his voice quieter now. "There was this woman. I don't know her name, but she's been here a few times over the past month. Blonde, pretty tall, probably late 20s or early 30s. She'd show up with a little girl, a kid, maybe 6 years old. I thought she might have been Jake's girlfriend or something." "A woman and a child?" Brian clarified, his pen now etching furiously. "You're sure about that?" Ping nodded quickly. "Yeah, positive, I saw them just last week. Monday or Tuesday, I think. She was coming out of his apartment holding one of those big reusable grocery bags, the kind you get from Trader Joe's. The little girl was holding a toy or something, looked like a stuffed animal maybe. They didn't say anything to me, but I don't know, the whole thing looked kinda tense." "Tense how?" Brian pressed, leaning in. "Did you hear them talking? Words exchanged? Maybe an argument?" Ping shook his head. "Not really, but the woman looked stiff, I guess. Like she was in a rush or didn't want anyone to notice her. The girl was just staring at the ground the whole time. Didn't seem like they wanted to hang around long." Kalinsky chimed back in, unable to let Ping have the spotlight for long. "Oh yeah, I remember her now. That's Jake's gal pal, isn't it? I've seen her before, coming in all quiet-like, and the last time she was dragging some big old suitcase behind her." She eyed Jensen meaningfully. "You know how that looks, right, officer?" Jensen's jaw tightened, though he didn't bite on her overly dramatic implication. "Have you ever heard Jake and this woman arguing, or seen her doing anything unusual?" Kalinsky tisked loudly. "Honey, I don't sit there with my ear on the wall, but you'd have to be deaf not to have heard the yelling sometimes. Happens at night, usually real late. I always said to my husband, there's trouble brewing in that one. But he'd just brush me off." "You're saying they fought?" Melissa Carter's voice rang out now as she joined the conversation, her notepad equally full of scribbled notes. "Did you ever hear what they were arguing about?" Kalinsky shrugged. "Money maybe? That's what I'd guess. Or that kid. Relationships always go bad when there's a kid involved." Felicity Jones, who had been hovering on the outskirts of the group, finally spoke for the first time. "The woman, she was crying last time I saw her. I didn't want to say anything earlier, but I noticed it. Red eyes, puffy face. Jake was walking behind her like he was trying to calm her down. She hugged her arms as if protecting herself. I thought about calling someone, but I didn't want to interfere. You never know with stuff like that. Brian and Melissa exchanged glances. Clearly there was more to uncover here than a simple domestic dispute or a broken relationship. One thing was becoming clear. Jake Ford wasn't as reclusive as some had assumed, and whoever the blonde woman and her child were, they might hold the key to explaining what, or who, ended up inside that steel drum. Rachel, and the trail she left behind. Rachel Moore and her little girl Emily had vanished just as mysteriously as Jake Ford's life had come to a gruesome end. The morning after authorities discovered the steel drum, a deeper investigation began, and all signs pointed to Rachel. Detective Michael Drake stood in a dim NYPD briefing room, staring at a grainy security camera still projected on the wall. It showed a blonde woman emerging from Greenpoint Towers at dawn just 3 days earlier, lugging a large suitcase. She was unmistakably Rachel. Her hair was tied back into a loose ponytail, and she wore oversized sunglasses that nearly swallowed her face. "Tell me someone's got an ID on this woman," Drake said, the sharp impatience in his voice snapping his team into action. Officer Melissa Carter stepped forward, her notebook open. "Rachel Moore. That's the name neighbors gave us. She's been seen entering and leaving apartment 8B for months, always discreet, sometimes with that little girl of hers." Melissa motioned toward a new slide on the screen. It was a lighter, clearer shot of Rachel holding the hand of a small child. The girl stared at the ground, clutching a stuffed bunny in her free hand. Drake narrowed his eyes, leaning forward. "And no one knows if they were living there full-time?" "No confirmation yet," Melissa replied. "A couple of neighbors said it seemed like she was staying with Jake on and off. Others thought she was just visiting a lot. But ever since the smells started, no one saw her or the kid again. Then," she pointed to the screen, "we catch her on this tape at 5:43 a.m. 2 days ago, alone, by the looks of that suitcase." Carter hesitated before continuing. "She wasn't headed for a weekend getaway, sir." Drake let out a low, frustrated sigh and leaned back in his chair. "Great. So we've got a missing person with a front-row seat to what went down in 8B, or, more likely—" He didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone in the room was already thinking it. The suitcase and odd behavior. Rachel hadn't gone unnoticed in the days leading up to the discovery. Back at Greenpoint Towers, several neighbors began sharing details, giving detectives the fragments of a story that painted her as a woman on edge. "I saw her the night before she disappeared," Ping offered during a second interview with Officer Jensen. "It was late, probably after midnight. She was coming out of the elevator with that big suitcase. She looked frazzled, tired, kept looking over her shoulder like someone was following her." "What about the kid?" Melissa followed up. "Did you see the little girl too?" Ping shook his head. "No, just her. I thought it was weird. I mean, I never thought she'd do something like this, if that's what you're asking. She seemed like a mom, you know? Protective of her kid. But she looked scared that night, like she was in some kind of trouble." Another witness, a man from the 6th floor, claimed he saw Rachel outside by the curb minutes later, struggling to load the heavy suitcase into the trunk of a rideshare. "I asked if she needed help, just being neighborly, you know? But she kinda snapped at me. Said, 'No, I'm fine, I got it.' It was weird though. She's small, couldn't weigh more than $110 soaking wet, and that bag looked like it weighed a ton." He paused before adding, "She didn't even say thanks when I backed off. Just got in the car and left." The last digital footprint rideshare records quickly turned up a destination. Rachel's driver had dropped her off in Queens, near the edge of a long-stay motel notorious for its clientele, cash-only travelers and folks looking to stay off the grid. By the time officers reached the motel, Rachel and her daughter were long gone. Witnesses there remembered her, though. "She didn't check in or anything," explained a weary motel clerk with dark circles beneath his eyes. "But she stopped by the vending machine near my office. You don't forget someone dragging a suitcase that looked like it could have held a whole person inside. She bought snacks, chips, water, whatever. She seemed nervous as hell, like someone was chasing her." "You see the kid?" Drake asked, standing across the counter. The clerk nodded. "Yeah, a little girl, cute kid. Looked like she'd been crying, though. Kept her eyes down the entire time. Rachel," he paused, catching himself. "I mean, the woman, she was real short with her, snapped at her when she wandered too close to the office door." Drake straightened, trying to push past the growing frustration gnawing at him. "And you didn't think to write down her description? Her car? Anything?" The clerk held his hands up defensively. Listen, people come and go here with all sorts of baggage, literal and otherwise. It's not my job to ask questions. She didn't stick around long. 10 minutes maybe? Then she was gone. A deliberate disappearance piece by piece, Rachel's actions began to paint a picture of a woman desperate to vanish. Forensics at Jake's apartment confirmed traces of her DNA, not just in the living room but in the kitchen and on the steel drum itself. Garrett, a fresh-eyed forensic tech who joined the team after the steel drum was removed from the scene, provided a chilling update. We found faint, partial fingerprints matching Rachel Moore near the seal where the drum was bolted shut, he explained. Looks like she was the one who closed it. Drake sat down heavily at his desk, processing. If Rachel killed Jake, either in a fight or as a planned attack, one thing was obvious. She hadn't acted impulsively. The salt used to preserve the body, the detail with which she packed and sealed the drum, her calculated exit from the building, all of it suggested intent. Salt to slow the rot, Drake muttered aloud, and the suitcase, the vanishing act. She knew what she was doing. The clock ticks. As the hours turned into days, the urgency to find Rachel Moore heightened. For every clue the detectives uncovered, another question was left in its wake. If Rachel was responsible for Jake's death, what had driven her to such lengths? And how far was she willing to go to stay hidden? Back in the precinct's bullpen, Melissa flagged Drake down with a grim look on her face. "Boss," she started hesitantly, "you're not gonna like this, but a witness from a bus terminal in New Jersey just called in. They're saying they saw her and the kid there yesterday. They were boarding a bus heading south." Drake stood silent for a moment before biting out an order. "Get HQ on the horn and widen the search. No more delays." Rachel Moore might have thought she was gone for good, but for the NYPD, the chase had only just begun. Clues inside the steel drum. The steel drum, ominous and silent, sat like a centerpiece of horror in the corner of Jake Ford's cramped kitchen. Its rusted surface streaked with dark stains seemed almost defiant, as if daring anyone to uncover its secrets. The faint syrupy residue leaking out from beneath the bolted lid had already told its own grim tale, a tale of rot, death, and deliberate concealment. By the time forensics loaded the drum onto a gurney, the NYPD detectives had steeled themselves for answers, knowing full well the cost of asking such questions. Sergeant Laura Matthews led the team into the morgue once the drum arrived, her sharp eyes scanning the room like a hawk's. Detective Michael Drake followed close behind, his face taut with tension. The room smelled faintly of disinfectant, but a darker, more organic odor seeped from beneath the lid of the sealed container, filling the air like an invisible, suffocating weight. "All right," Matthews said, snapping on a thick pair of latex gloves. "Let's open Pandora's box." Forensic technician Garrett wheeled over a set of specialized tools, his face pale but composed. Carefully he began loosening the bolts securing the lid. Each metallic clang as the wrench turned was enough to make the detectives flinch, their mental preparation slowly wearing thin. By the time the last bolt was removed, the silence in the room was a living thing, thick and oppressive. The lid came free with an ominous pop, and the stench of decay that exploded out was so powerful that even those behind protective masks reeled back. Garrett staggered, gagging behind his shield. "Jesus Christ," he muttered, covering his stomach with one hand. Drake leaned in cautiously, his eyes fixed on the contents inside. When the lid was fully removed, the sight that met the team confirmed their worst fears. The contents of the drum. Within the drum lay the dismembered remains of a human being. The forensics lights reflected off an unsettling whitish-yellow layer that coated the flesh, a sickly, waxy film that fringe areas of saturated salt layered over it. The liquid within was a briny mixture of decomposition fluids and preservatives. The salt granules had clumped in patches against what was left of the body as if an obscene mockery of preservation. Matthews, known for her iron stomach, broke the silence with a clinical remark. "The salt," she noted, gesturing to the crust forming around the victim's torso, "has slowed the bacterial breakdown. This wasn't done to hide the smell, not entirely. Whoever packed this drum knew exactly what they were doing. They preserved the body intentionally to buy themselves time." Garrett, sweating bullets now, nodded. "It's macabre, as if they needed enough time to get away before anyone suspected this." He hesitated before continuing. "The process, it's calculated. The killer didn't panic. This wasn't someone who lost their temper and acted impulsively. There's method here." Drake grimaced. "We're not dealing with just a murder here," he muttered. "This was a cover-up from the start. Somebody did this with purpose." His eyes scanned the drum for any useful evidence as Garrett continued to examine the edges of the large container with gloved fingers. As he leaned in closer, the tech spotted something lodged near the inner wall of the drum, a tiny chip of metal, barely larger than a thumbnail. "Hold on," Garrett said, reaching in with a pair of forceps. "We've got something." He pulled out the fragment gingerly and set it down on a sterile tray. The detective stepped closer as Garrett examined the piece under a magnifying glass. "It's part of a blade," Garrett announced, his voice steady but tight. "Looks like it snapped off during whatever happened before the body was sealed in here. If we're lucky, it might give us a lead on the weapon used." Matthews let out a low whistle. "A fragment from the murder weapon. That could be our smoking gun right there." The cause of death revealed forensic pathologist Dr. Elena Cruz arrived shortly after. She approached the drum with practiced calm, her expression unreadable behind her mask. For the next 3 hours, Cruz and her team worked meticulously through the grim process of documenting, removing, and analyzing the contents of the steel beacon of death. Her findings painted a picture of unimaginable brutality. "The body shows multiple stab wounds across the chest, abdomen, and back," Cruz began, her voice emotionless but her tone heavy with the weight of what she'd seen. "Whoever did this attacked the victim relentlessly. From the angle and depth of the wounds, it appears the killer used excessive force, almost as if it were personal. This wasn't just murder, it was rage, fury." "What about the dismemberment?" Drake asked grimly, arms crossed tightly across his chest. Cruz removed her gloves and gestured toward the tray containing slices of neatly severed limbs and a torso. "Post-mortem," she said. "It was done after death, likely with a large serrated blade." She gestured to the snapped fragment Garrett had pulled from the drum. "That fragment matches the cuts on the bones. We'll confirm it later through analysis, but I'd say it's part of a heavy-duty hunting knife or carving knife." "Let me guess," muttered Drake. "The kind you'd pick up at any department store without raising an eyebrow." Cruz merely nodded. "What's the timeline here?" asked Melissa Carter, who had just entered the morgue and caught the tail end of Cruz's explanation. "The victim's been dead roughly 6 to 8 days. Cruz replied. "Probably kept in the drum since immediately after they were killed. The salt would have slowed decomposition in normal circumstances, but the heat inside that apartment started accelerating things again." Melissa tilted her head, narrowing her eyes in thought. 6 to 8 days? Matches the timeline when neighbors last saw Jake Ford alive. Cruz picked up a sheet of notes. "One more thing, there are defense wounds. The victim fought back." Drake's head shot up, eyes sharpening. "Against who? Rachel Moore?" "Possibly," Cruz replied cautiously. "We'll need a DNA match on the skin cells lodged under his fingernails, but all early signs point to someone he knew, someone close." The nail in the coffin. Before leaving the morgue, Garrett handed a final piece of evidence to Drake, sealed tightly in a plastic bag. "We found this in the drum, tucked near one of the folds of the body," Garrett said softly. Drake glanced down at the bag and froze. Inside was a thin, silver bracelet, the kind you'd find in a child's toy store. It was cheap, colorful, and unmistakable. On its surface, the name Emily had been engraved in tiny letters. Drake's jaw tightened as he passed the bag to Matthews. "Rachel Moore didn't just put Jake Ford in that drum," he muttered through clenched teeth. "She left her fingerprints all over it." Violence in the relationship. As the pieces of the investigation fell into place, one undeniable fact began to emerge. The relationship between Jake Ford and Rachel Moore wasn't a picturesque love story. It was a powder keg, volatile, fractured, and toxic. Melissa Carter sat at her desk, thumbing through pages of neighbor testimonies and police reports, her pen dancing nervously against her notepad. Clues were piling up, but this wasn't just about finding hard evidence. It was about figuring out the why. Why would a woman like Rachel Moore, a mother no less, end up in a situation so gruesome, so irrevocable? And why had Jake Ford been the one to end up in a steel drum? She sighed and turned to Detective Drake, who was hunched over his own collection of crime scene photos, rubbing his temples in frustration. "Mike," she said, breaking the silence that had settled over the precinct bullpen, "I keep coming back to this. Neighbors said their relationship seemed off. But how does off turn into this? How do we jump from yelling matches to murder?" Drake leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing as he processed her words. "When people live in tension long enough," he said, his voice low, "it doesn't just simmer, it boils. Someone snaps, and in this case—" He trailed off, gesturing toward the photo of Rachel Moore's grim departure from Greenpoint Towers, suitcase in tow. "Rachel didn't just snap," Melissa replied, frowning. "This wasn't a heat-of-the-moment thing, this was methodical. The salt, the drum, everything. Whatever happened in 8B that night wasn't impulsive. It had been building for a while, and I need to know how we missed that. Behind closed doors. Speaking to Rachel's childhood best friend, Rebecca Lane, authorities uncovered the first flickers of a pattern, one that painted Jake Ford in a much darker light than the lonely, hard-working freelancer neighbors had described. Rachel tried to get away from him once, you know, Rebecca told Melissa during a long interview at the precinct. Her voice was brittle, worn with age and worry. This was before she moved into his building full-time. She called me crying, told me he was yelling, saying awful things about how she'd never be able to take care of Emily without him. Melissa leaned forward, her pen poised. And what did she do? Did she try to leave? Rebecca hesitated, swallowing hard. She planned to. She packed up her things and came to stay at my place for a few days. I thought that was the end of it, but then he showed up. Drake, who had been listening silently from the corner of the room, raised an eyebrow. Showed up how? He came banging on my door, screaming that she stole his kid, Rebecca said, anger flashing momentarily in her tired brown eyes. And Rachel, she just froze, let him inside, even let him hug Emily like nothing had happened. I told her to call the cops, but she just kept saying, "It's okay. I'm fine." You know how many women say that when they're not fine at all? The tension builds. An analysis of social media and phone records revealed a darker side of Jake Ford. While to most people he appeared mild-mannered and cooperative, the private world of text between the pair showed a side of him that was manipulative at best, and chilling at worst. One text stood out, dated 2 weeks before the murder. "Rachel, I'm not kidding. You think you can walk away, with my daughter, over my dead body?" That text, Drake muttered as he read it aloud in the precinct office, isn't just anger, that's a threat, clear as day. He looked up at Melissa, his face hard and grim. The guy clearly knew how to twist a knife, and I'm not talking literally. Emotional abuse can make people feel trapped, like there's no way out. More texts revealed cycles of pseudo-apologies. "Baby, I'm sorry for yelling. You know I love you." Another followed hours later. "But don't make me mad again. You need to get your shit together." "What's scary is," Melissa said, scrolling through the texts on her screen, "he always dangles Emily over her head. Financial support, stability, it's all tied to threatening her about the kid." Neighbors begin to speak out. It wasn't just Rachel's friends who noticed the cracks in the couple's facade. Digging deeper, the detectives revisited several neighbors who had held back earlier details. Suddenly, everyone seemed to have a story. "I heard 'em fighting all the time," Mrs. Kalinsky admitted during her second interview. "But Jake was slick, you know? You'd hear him yelling at her and then, bam! He'd cover it up with some sweet talk like nothing happened. 1 minute, you're useless. Next minute, Rachel, you know you're a good mom." It was like he played both sides just to mess with her head. Ping Zhao, rarely one to poke into others' business, finally shared what he overheard during one late-night squabble. "It was bad," Ping said, his expression tight. "He was screaming about money, how he paid for everything, told her she couldn't even qualify for daycare without him. She cried. It wasn't yelling back like you'd expect. It was, I don't know, broken? Then it got quiet. I didn't hear him leave, though. I figured he stayed the night." "That," Melissa muttered to herself as she jotted down Ping's statement. "Sounds like a pattern. Keep someone on a leash, make them believe they'll fail without you, and you've got them stuck." The breaking point. Despite the mounting tension that painted Jake as controlling and manipulative, evidence from friends and co-workers suggested Rachel wasn't without her own struggles. A single mom with what appeared to be no formal job, Rachel had a history of eviction notices, unpaid bills, and strained family ties. The only constant in her life seemed to be her daughter, Emily. Rebecca Lane illuminated this further when she tearfully recounted a phone call from Rachel just days before Jake's murder. "She told me Jake was going to take Emily away if she didn't get her act together, said he threatened to file for custody. That was the last straw for her. You take a mom's kid away, you might as well rip her heart out." "And what did you say to her?" Melissa asked carefully. Rebecca's shoulders slumped. "I told her to breathe, told her to come stay at my place like last time, but I don't know if she believed she had options anymore." When Melissa relayed this to Drake later that evening, his face darkened and he leaned back in his chair, staring blankly at the ceiling fan. "This wasn't just rage," he said finally. "This wasn't just a few yelling matches. Rachel Moore, she was backed into a corner. A dangerous dynamic." The investigation had uncovered more than enough to suggest that Jake and Rachel's relationship wasn't just troubled, it was explosive. Manipulation, power plays, and veiled threats fueled an atmosphere of fear and desperation. But unraveling the question of whether Rachel acted out of pure malice or survival wasn't black and white, and somewhere in the middle of it all was Emily, a child caught in the storm of two lives breaking apart. Drake sighed heavily as he flipped a photo of Rachel and Emily, taken months before the murder. "The scariest part about relationships like this," he muttered to himself, "is by the time the violence starts, it's already too late to break the cycle." The hunt for Rachel and her daughter. When Rachel Moore vanished from Greenpoint Towers, it wasn't just a simple getaway, it was the beginning of one of the most intense manhunts the NYPD had seen in years. For Detective Michael Drake, this wasn't just a game of cat and mouse, it was a race against the clock, knowing that every hour increased the chance that Rachel, and more importantly, her daughter Emily, might disappear forever. First clues: the head start. By the time Rachel's disappearance hit the radar, she already had a 2-day head start. The rideshare trail from Greenpoint Towers had placed her in Queens, near a notoriously run-down long-stay motel, but when officers arrived, they found themselves greeted with empty vending machines and vague memories from the staff. "She didn't check in or anything," the clerk admitted, rubbing his eyes as if he hadn't slept in weeks. "She just came in with that huge suitcase, like really huge, bought some snacks and left real fast. She was nervous as hell, kept looking over her shoulder like someone was chasing her." "And the kid?" Drake pressed from across the counter, his voice sharp like the edge of a blade. Yeah, I saw her. Kid had one of those stuffed bunnies with her," the clerk said tiredly. "Didn't really say anything. The mom snapped at her when she wandered too close to the front office. Told her to stay close." Drake exchanged a glance with Officer Melissa Carter, who stood with her notepad in hand. "How long was she here?" Melissa asked. 5 minutes, 10. The clerk frowned. "I don't know, not long, but she looked like she wanted to get out of here as fast as possible. Didn't even make eye contact with anyone. Just got back in the car and left." Drake's jaw tightened. Rachel wasn't making stops for leisure. Everything she was doing screamed escape. "Did you catch the car make? A license plate?" Melissa asked. The question hung in the air for a moment too long. The clerk shook his head. "Sorry, didn't think to look." Drake sighed, the frustration visible in his eyes. Every lost detail felt like a needle poking at the case's seams. "All right, we've got to widen the net before she slips through completely," he muttered as they left the office. On the run, a trail of breadcrumbs. Piecing together. Rachel's movements from there became an uphill battle. Surveillance footage was sporadic at best, but in bits and pieces, a blurry pattern began to emerge. Every stop painted the image of a woman who was determined, desperate, and methodical. "She's good," Melissa admitted, going over traffic cam stills. "She's sticking to cash, avoiding big hotels and keeping a low profile. This wasn't on a whim. She's been planning this." "She's not perfect, though," Drake reminded her, slapping a clipboard onto her desk. "Look here, bus stations, gas stations, motels. Everyone remembers her. She's dragging that damn suitcase around, and no one forgets a suitcase that big with a kid by her side." He shook his head. "It's a miracle she hasn't ditched it." Melissa tapped her pen on her lips, thinking. Maybe she can't, if she's keeping something in there. She didn't have to finish the thought. Both their minds flashed back to Jake Ford, the steel drum, the salt. Rachel wasn't just running because of the murder. That suitcase might hold more than clothes. The witness in New Jersey. The tension surrounding the case hit a boiling point 3 days later when a tip came in from a bus terminal in Newark, New Jersey. A maintenance worker remembered seeing a woman and child matching Rachel and Emily's description boarding a bus heading south. "I've got their exact seats," the terminal employee said, leaning over the counter as officers descended on the station. "She paid cash, but I still got it logged in the system." Drake scanned over the screen showing the bus ticket purchase with urgency. "Raleigh, North Carolina," he muttered. "She's heading away from the city, probably trying to get to smaller towns where she can vanish completely." Melissa exhaled slowly. "We'll never make it in time to meet the bus at its final stop." "Then we intercept," Drake said firmly, his mind already calculating. He turned to the rest of the room. "Get local law enforcement in North Carolina on this now. Pull that bus over before it gets there." Interception on the highway. By the time officers flagged down the bus on a lonely stretch of highway outside Smithfield, North Carolina, tensions had reached their peak. Local authorities swept the vehicle while passengers stared wide-eyed, muttering to one another in confusion. When they reached Rachel's seat, all they found was an empty fast food bag and a wad of crumpled napkins. "She got off," one officer informed Drake over the phone, his voice bordered with frustration. "We're questioning passengers now, but it looks like she got off at an unscheduled rest stop. No one's quite sure when." Drake rubbed his temples, a string of quiet curses under his breath. "She's slippery, I'll give her that much. All right, check those rest stop cameras. There's gotta be something there." Sure enough, a grainy clip from a nearby convenience store revealed Rachel dragging her suitcase toward a car idling in the corner of the lot. The plates were almost unreadable, but it was enough to tell Drake that she was no longer working alone. "Whoever's helping her just made this a hell of a lot harder," he muttered, slamming the video report onto his desk back in New York. Unraveling the plan. With every passing day, the pressure mounted. From Rachel's careful use of cash to her ability to keep Emily quiet and cooperative, it was clear she had meticulously planned the escape. What wasn't clear, though, was where she was headed. "I think she's heading for somewhere familiar," Melissa suggested. "A relative, a friend, somewhere she thinks she won't stick out too much." "That'd make sense," Drake replied, "but she's also smart enough to stay off the grid. Wherever she's going, it's gotta be somewhere remote. Less traffic, fewer eyes. A break in the case." Just as morale began to dip, another witness provided a breakthrough. An elderly couple in a sleepy North Carolina town spotted Rachel and Emily walking along the edge of a road carrying groceries. "I thought it was odd," the man recalled during a phone interview with officers. "She looked real tired and the kid was clinging to some stuffed bunny, asked to borrow our phone, but I told her the line's out. Didn't want to tell her that I just didn't trust her." "Which way were they headed?" Melissa asked on the call. "East," the man answered. "Toward the park, I think." Drake leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. Rachel wasn't just running, she was stalling, sticking to wooded areas, back roads, and quiet corners where a mother and child wouldn't draw dangerous attention. "All right," he said firmly, standing up and grabbing his coat. "We're heading east. It's time to cut her off before she disappears completely." The chase continued relentlessly, the ever-growing tension pressing on everyone's chest. Every clue seemed to unravel another layer to Rachel's plan, but she had left too many breadcrumbs behind. Somewhere out there among the shadows of small-town America, Rachel and Emily were waiting to be found, or to slip away into the void forever. Rachel Moore's shocking confession. It was a damp gray morning when they brought Rachel Moore into the interrogation room. Her wrists were cuffed, her face pale, and her hair hung loose around her face like she hadn't touched it in days. Her daughter Emily had been taken into Child Protective Services mere hours earlier. Whatever fragile mask Rachel had worn during her flight over the past 10 days had shattered completely. Detective Michael Drake sat across from her, his gaze steady but piercing. To Rachel's right, Officer Melissa Carter sat quietly, pen poised over her notepad, poised for whatever confession might emerge. Rachel slumped into the metal chair, her entire body curved as though she were physically bearing the weight of what she was about to say. The room felt as heavy as the truth she was about to unfurl. Drake leaned forward, folding his hands on the table with deliberate calm. "Rachel," he began, his voice level. "You ran for 10 days. Your prints are on the steel drum. Your DNA is all over that apartment, and right now, all I need from you is the truth. What happened inside apartment 8B? Her lips quivered as she let out a shaky exhale. "I didn't mean for it to end like this." "End like what?" Drake pressed, voice tightening. "With Jake Ford dead, with you stuffing his body into a drum packed with salt? You're going to have to be more specific, Rachel." "It wasn't supposed to happen," she said, her voice breaking into a dry whisper. "I swear I wasn't planning any of this." "You're telling me it just happened?" Melissa finally spoke, her words edged with disbelief. "How does that work? You don't accidentally kill someone and then take the time to pack them into a container like that." Rachel winced, wiping her hands over her tear-streaked face. She was still trembling. It was a fight. It was Jake. He wouldn't stop. He was yelling and tearing through the apartment. That's just who he was." "You don't get it. You didn't know him." Drake exchanged a glance with Melissa before turning his eyes back to Rachel. "Then tell us, Rachel. Paint us a picture. Let us see the Jake Ford you knew." Her voice cracked as she began to speak. "He was charming in the beginning. Funny, laid back. I was struggling. I had Emily by myself, and he knew that. He always knew he held all the cards. He told me I could move in. Said it'd be better for Emily, more stable. He said I'd be saving money. I thought he was helping me." Drake's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He let her continue. "But then it started," she said, emotion flooding her voice. "The control, little comments at first. 'You're messy, you know that?' Or, 'I don't know why you can't keep up, Rachel. I'm the one working.' Then he'd start in on Emily, blaming me for everything about her, like what she ate or how she looked tired one day. He always said I wasn't enough, that I couldn't do it on my own. Psychological abuse, Melissa muttered, writing furiously. And you just stayed? Rachel shot her a weary, almost bitter look. You don't understand what it's like. When someone tears you down so much, you forget you can leave. You start believing them. The night it happened. Drake cut in gently, coaxing her back to the topic. Rachel, what happened the night Jake died? Walk me through everything, not the excuses, not the maybes, the facts. Her breathing quickened and she gripped the edge of the table tightly like it was the only thing keeping her upright. For a few seconds it looked like she might not speak at all, then suddenly, the dam broke. It was late, she began. Emily was already in bed. Jake came back from wherever he'd been, drunk, loud. He slammed the door so hard that it woke her up. I told him to be quiet and he just snapped. I don't even remember what set him off this time, something I forgot to do or didn't do. I don't even know anymore. And he started yelling, about how I was clueless, about how... Her voice choked off briefly before she regained control. About how Emily wasn't going to live with me much longer, that he was going to take her away. You'll lose her, Rachel, he said. I'll call CPS, I'll tell them you're unstable, she'd be better off without you. He'd said that before, but this time, I believed him. Melissa looked at her sharply. And that's when you killed him? No! Rachel cried, horrified at the coldness of the question. No, not yet. I tried to calm him down. I told him I'd do better, anything to make him stop, but he just got louder. Emily came out of her room crying. She thought he was hurting me. She ran over to my side, hugging me, begging him to stop. She began sobbing now, hands shaking in her lap. He called her a brat. He yelled at her. My baby. That's when I pushed him back. I told him to shut up for once, and he shoved me into the wall. Hard, my head. She gestured to the side of her head, which was still faintly bruised. I was dizzy. Emily started screaming, and he grabbed her arm like he was about to pull her away from me. Now her voice sank, quiet but deadly. That's when I grabbed the knife, the moment of no return. Drake didn't blink. You stabbed him? Rachel nodded, slow and deliberate, staring down at the metal table. It wasn't planned. I swear to God it wasn't planned. I saw it on the counter and acted. I just wanted him to stop, but I didn't realize I kept going. I don't even remember how many times. 16, Drake stated bluntly. 16 stab wounds, Rachel. That doesn't sound like self-defense anymore. That sounds like rage. She broke under the weight of his words, but didn't argue. I don't know what came over me. All I could see was him pulling Emily away, him screaming, him ruining everything, and it was like I couldn't stop. Melissa pressed closer, her tone softer now. And after, what did you do? Rachel let out a bitter laugh through her tears. You've seen the body. What do you think I did? I panicked. I didn't know where to go, what to do, so I cleaned it up. At least, I thought I did. I wrapped him up, shoved him into that drum, poured salt over everything. I read somewhere that salt preserves things, keeps the smell down. It didn't, Drake cut in. I know that now, she snapped, anguished. I thought, if I got rid of him, if I just ran far enough, I could give Emily a chance, a real chance. She deserved better than that life, better than me ending up in prison and her going to him. A haunting truth. By the time Rachel had finished, Melissa and Drake sat in silence for a long moment. There was anger, sure, at the crime, the brutality, but there was also something heavier hanging in the room. The undeniable weight of Rachel's desperation. This wasn't a premeditated murder of malice. This was a woman who'd been drowning for years and had finally lashed out the only way she knew how. Drake broke the silence, his voice sharp with finality. Rachel, you're going to prison. You get that, don't you? Rachel nodded numbly. I know, just promise me one thing. Take care of Emily. Make sure she's safe. Drake didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was colder, harder. Emily's safety should have been your first priority, not this. And with that, Rachel's break from reality, her breakdown was complete. The truth was out, and all that was left was the reckoning to come. The killer's chilling explanation. In the sterile silence of the interrogation room, Rachel Moore leaned back in her chair. Her face was blank, her eyes hollow and exhausted, as though she'd already come to terms with what she had done. The tension was palpable, wrapping around the room like a vice. Across the table, Detective Michael Drake studied her, his expression unreadable behind a carefully constructed mask of professionalism. Beside him, Officer Melissa Carter gripped her pen tighter than necessary, her notepad already filled with shaky handwriting from earlier interviews. No one expected what Rachel was about to say. I know what I did looks awful, Rachel began, her voice barely a whisper. Her tone was cold, almost clinical. which somehow made her confession all the more disturbing. "But you have to understand, people like Jake don't let you walk away, they don't let you live." Drake tilted his head slightly, a quiet signal for her to continue. Her lips trembled. "You don't see it when you first meet someone like him," she said, her voice gaining strength, though it was tinged with a growing bitterness. "They're charming. Funny. They know how to make you trust them, and they know exactly when to flip the switch. Jake was good at that. He knew when to be kind, when to make me think I owed him something. And then, when he had me and Emily, he changed." "Changed how?" Melissa asked, her voice steady but sharp. Rachel's hollow eyes flickered toward her. "Control," she said simply. "It always starts with control. Telling me I couldn't manage Emily without him, that I was a terrible mother, that I'd lose her. That was his favorite card to play, holding Emily over my head. If I didn't listen, he'd remind me that he could make my life worse. Call CPS, take her away. And what could I do? I'd lose everything, and he knew it." "But was it just words, or did it go further?" Drake pressed, his voice still calm, but with an edge sharp enough to cut. Rachel's head snapped up, her jaw tightening. "You're trying to minimize him," she shot back, her voice suddenly carrying weight. "It wasn't just words. He'd grab me, shove me. He'd slam the door so hard it'd wake Emily just to make a point. I can't tell you how many nights I sat crying in the bathroom because I didn't know what to do. I wanted to leave, I swear, but he said he'd find me wherever I went. He said there was no escaping him." The room fell silent for a moment. The gravity of her words hung like a dense fog. The breaking point. Drake leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "So, let's talk about that night. You've told us about the fight. You've told us about the stabbing. But what I don't understand is the rest. The intentional cover-up, the drum, the salt. That wasn't just survival. That wasn't panic. That was planning." Rachel's demeanor shifted, her shoulders slumped, and a small dry laugh escaped her throat. "You think I planned any of it?" she asked, shaking her head. "Do you have any idea what was going through my head that night?" "Why don't you tell us?" Melissa said, her tone unreadable. Rachel stared down at her hands for a long moment before answering. "He said he was going to take Emily," she began, her voice lower now, like she was speaking directly to herself. "It wasn't the first time he threatened that, but this time it was different. He was drunk, angry. I'd seen him like this before, but he never grabbed her. That's what changed. He went for her like she was some piece of property he could just drag away from me." Her fingers curled into fists so tightly that her knuckles turned white. "I thought, no, not this time, not her. You can call me weak, but she's innocent." And in that moment I couldn't think. All I saw was her face, terrified and crying. All I heard was him screaming at me, blaming me for everything. All I thought was, he's never going to stop. Never. "So you grabbed the knife," Drake said flatly, leaving no room for doubt. Rachel nodded, meeting his eyes with a piercing intensity. "I grabbed the knife, yes. I didn't count how many times I stabbed him. I wasn't in control. It wasn't like in the movies where you take one swing and everything stops. He kept fighting me, even after the first stab. He fell back, but he didn't stop. I had to make him stop. It was him or us." 16 times, Melissa interjected, her voice razor sharp. "That's how many stab wounds the report shows. 16, Rachel. That's not just making him stop. That's something else." Rachel's eyes were glassy now, but her voice stayed firm. "You weren't there," she said, almost daring Melissa to argue. "You didn't see his face. You didn't see what he was going to do. He deserved it." The salt and the steel drum. Drake ignored the tension between Rachel and Melissa. He leaned against the table, his expression hard to read. "All right, so you killed him. But let's talk about what happened after, Rachel. That's what everyone's struggling to understand. Why the salt? Why the steel drum? That wasn't survival, that was something else. Walk us through your reasoning." Rachel exhaled, leaning back in her chair. "You really want to know?" she asked bitterly. "Because it wasn't just about getting rid of him, it was about time, buying time. I knew. I couldn't just leave him there. I couldn't call the police. They'd take Emily from me and blame me for everything. And if someone found the body too soon, I'd be caught before I had a plan. So I thought about the salt. I'd read somewhere that it preserves things. I didn't want it to rot, to smell. I didn't have time to bury him. I didn't have time for anything." "And the steel drum?" Melissa prodded. Rachel's lips pressed into a thin line. "It was downstairs in the basement. I saw it weeks ago when Jake sent me to throw out some old boxes. In that moment I just thought, this is big enough to keep him inside, so I rolled him up, packed the salt, and sealed the lid." Drake's face was stony. "Then you packed up your daughter, your suitcase, and ran." Rachel nodded. "What choice did I have?" A chilling logic. Melissa scribbled in her notepad, her jaw tight. "What I don't get," she said after a moment, "is how you could do all this and not think about your daughter. Did you even try to think about the trauma you were creating for her?" Rachel turned to Melissa, her calm mask cracking into something darker, something raw. "You think I haven't thought about that?" she shot back. "You think I don't know what I've done? The truth is, I was already failing her. Every day I stayed in that apartment, every time I let him scream at us, control us, I was failing her. At least now, she doesn't have to live in fear. At least now, she has a chance." Reflection in the silence. The room fell into a heavy silence once again. Drake sat back, his eyes studying Rachel like she was some kind of unsolvable puzzle. Melissa looked down at her notes, her pen hovering but unmoving. Finally, Drake spoke. "Rachel, what you did wasn't just protecting Emily, it was creating another nightmare. Whatever you thought you were saving her from, you didn't. A murder can't be the answer. And you knew that." Rachel didn't respond. Her hands trembled slightly on the table and she looked away, no longer willing or able to meet his eyes. Drake brushed his hand over his face, letting out a quiet sigh. "You said Jake never let you live. Well, Rachel, now you're never going to live either." Conclusions from the investigation. As the investigation unfolded, every piece of evidence pointed to one undeniable truth. Rachel Moore's actions were not as simple as self-defense. Detective Drake and Officer Melissa Carter sat in the dimly lit precinct briefing room, surrounded by stacks of evidence, crime scene photos, forensic reports, and recorded witness testimonies. The room was quiet save for the occasional hum of the overhead fluorescent lights, each investigator lost in thought as they pieced together the final moments in apartment 8B. "All right," Drake began, leaning over the table and placing his palm flat on the photos of the steel drum. His tone was measured, his eyes tired but sharp. "Let's put it all on the table. What do we know?" Melissa Carter reached for her notebook, flipping through pages of notes she had scribbled furiously over weeks of chasing leads, interrogating witnesses, and untangling the fractured story. "We know Rachel stabbed Jake Ford 16 times, she stated bluntly, her pen tapping against the page. According to her, it all started when Jake threatened to take Emily away. We know they were fighting, neighbors verified consistent arguing for months. And we have forensic evidence confirming Rachel as the killer. Her fingerprints were all over the murder weapon, the steel drum, and even the salt bags used to pack the body." Drake nodded but didn't look satisfied. "The forensics alone don't tell us why. This wasn't just a spur-of-the-moment attack, Melissa. People don't stab someone 16 times if they're trying to stop a single act of violence, pack the body in a drum with salt, and that's no longer heat of the moment. That's planning, a cover-up." He grabbed a photo of the drum, tapping it for emphasis. "This wasn't just self-defense, this was cold execution, plain and simple." Melissa raised an eyebrow. "But she ran. That's not the behavior of someone calculated enough to kill with premeditation, is it? She panicked. She thought the system would turn against her if she called the police," she countered. "Look at her history, Mike. Jake had methodically manipulated her for years, financially, mentally. She wasn't in the right state of mind. It was survival instinct. Maybe she went too far, God knows she did, but I wouldn't call this premeditated. Desperate, yes. But murder in the first degree?" Melissa paused, visibly conflicted. "I don't know." Drake dropped into his chair with a heavy sigh, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Desperate doesn't excuse drawing a knife and turning someone into a pincushion." His voice softened slightly as though he could hear the argument swirling in Melissa's head. "Look, I get it. She was scared. She felt trapped. Hell, all the texts, all the testimonies, they paint Jake Ford like some controlling monster. But this wasn't survival, Melissa. This was a woman who'd had enough and snapped, and that's what makes her dangerous. The forensics that sealed her fate." Melissa skimmed through the forensic reports in her notebook. "Here's the thing that keeps coming up. The salt." She looked up, shaking her head as if still trying to believe it herself. "You don't pack someone's body in industrial salt to slow decomposition unless you know exactly what you're doing. She wasn't just reacting in that moment. The drum, the salt, hell, even the idea to seal it off in the basement, this wasn't improvised, it wasn't clean, but it was intentional. If she didn't plan the murder, she sure as hell planned what to do after." Drake crossed his arms. "And that's what troubles me most. The way she talks about it, it's not even clear she regrets any of it. She gave herself plenty of chances to turn back, to call us, to ask for help, anything. But she didn't. She came up with a plan, put her daughter in a suitcase, and ran. That's not someone who's just scared. That's someone who's committed." "But look at her state when we caught her," Melissa argued, her voice tinged with frustration. "She was exhausted, broken. You think that was the face of someone with a calculated mind? By the time we found her, she was running on fumes. She panicked and rolled with a terrible plan. You're telling me that's the same woman who premeditated a murder with time to think it through? She had time, Drake shot back firmly, jabbing his finger toward the note in front of him. She had at least 8 days between the murder and when neighbors started smelling something in that hallway. 8 damn days to think about what she'd done, to go to the cops, to at least give that kid a chance at a better outcome. Instead, she thought about salt and airtight seals. I don't care how panicked you are, Melissa. That's enough to call it planning in my book. Victim versus perpetrator. Both detectives fell silent, tension hanging thick in the room. Finally, Melissa closed her notebook with a sigh. So that's it, huh? We're calling her a monster now? 16 stab wounds and she's the predator? She leaned back, crossing her arms. What about the years Jake spent tearing her down, isolating her from everyone around her, the way he used her kid against her? Drake's eyes narrowed. Jake Ford wasn't an angel. He was a manipulator. Hell, he might have been on the road to becoming even worse than that. But we can't ignore what Rachel Moore did here, Melissa. The line between victim and perpetrator gets blurry in cases like this, but at the end of the day, we have to draw it somewhere. And Rachel crossed it in blood. Melissa didn't immediately respond. She traced absent-minded circles along the edge of her pen, her brows furrowed deep in thought. I don't know, Mike. I just wonder, if the abuse had been caught sooner, would we even be sitting here piecing together a murder trial? Or would she have gotten out alive? Would Jake? Drake's jaw tightened, but his tone softened slightly. Maybe. Or maybe Jake's threats were empty, and he would have gone on his miserable way without laying more than a hand on her. Either way, we're not here to decide what could have happened. We're here to figure out what did. The conclusion. The NYPD ultimately reached a consensus that Rachel Moore's actions went far beyond self-defense. The physical evidence told a sharp and definitive story. 16 stab wounds, a preserved and hidden body, and a desperate but meticulous attempt to flee the scene. She wasn't just a scared woman protecting her daughter, Drake reported solemnly to the district attorney's office. She was scared, yes, but she became something else. She didn't just stop Jake Ford, she went out of her way to erase him. That changes the narrative. Still, Melissa Carter couldn't shake the feeling that the system had failed Rachel long before any knife was ever drawn. She was a victim, she murmured to herself later that evening as she packed her things. A victim who became her worst nightmare, and now her daughter's going to pay the price for both of them. Drake overheard her, pausing at the door of the precinct bullpen as he lit a cigarette. The truth is, once someone breaks, there's no unbreaking them, he replied quietly. Rachel didn't just kill Jake Ford, she killed every chance she had at being anything but this. The verdict and fallout. The courtroom was packed to the brim as Rachel Moore stood before the judge, her wrists shackled in front of her, her face a pale mask of defeat. It had been months since her arrest, months of public speculation, investigative breakthroughs, and endless debates in living rooms, newsroom panels, and social media comment sections. The case of Rachel Moore versus the state of New York was no longer just about what happened in apartment 8B. It had become a national flashpoint. Was she a victim of abuse who snapped under unimaginable pressure? Or was she a cold-blooded murderer who hid behind her traumatic circumstances? The trial of the year. The trial itself was a spectacle, watched by millions on televisions across America. Rachel's defense team argued that this had never been a premeditated murder, but the act of a woman pushed to the brink. They painted a vivid, harrowing picture of her life with Jake Ford, his cruel manipulation, the relentless psychological abuse, the constant threats to take her daughter away. Expert witnesses took the stand, including therapists who had reviewed Rachel's years-long history of anxiety and trauma. They spoke of how sustained emotional dominance could fracture a person's psyche, reducing Rachel to little more than what one psychologist referred to as a caged animal, lashing out in desperation. But the prosecution was ruthless. Desperation, they said, didn't excuse her actions. Assistant District Attorney Monica Ruiz delivered blistering arguments, pairing sharp logic with icy detachment. Rachel Moore didn't just kill Jake Ford, Monica declared in her closing arguments, pacing in front of the jury. She butchered him. 16 stab wounds. 16. And let's not forget what happened afterward. The drum, the salt, the meticulous cover-up. This wasn't panic, it wasn't fear, it was deliberate, it was methodical, and it shows intent. She paused, allowing the weight of her words to settle in the courtroom. If we allow Rachel Moore to walk free because of her tragic history, what message are we sending? That murder is forgivable if we can just feel sympathetic enough? The jury shifted uncomfortably. Rachel sat motionless, her expression unreadable. Rachel's last words. Before sentencing, Rachel had the chance to address the court. She rose from her seat slowly, the chains around her wrists jangling faintly, and turned to face the room. She didn't try to defend herself anymore. There was no point. With measured breaths, she finally spoke, her voice softer than anyone expected. "I've spent the last few months thinking about that night. I've replayed it over and over until it felt like I couldn't breathe anymore. I keep asking myself, could I have stopped? Could I have done something differently?" She hesitated, her lips trembling, but no tears came. "The truth is, I don't know. I don't know if I had it in me to walk away anymore. Jake wasn't just a man to me, he was a storm I'd been trapped in for years. He drained me bit by bit until there was nothing left but fear and anger." She turned briefly toward the jury, her eyes locking with a few members for a tense moment. "I'm not asking for your forgiveness, I don't deserve it. What I did? I'll live with it for the rest of my life, but I will say this. Jake Ford was never going to stop. He would have taken Emily, he would have destroyed her the way he destroyed me." Her voice finally cracked as she said, "And I couldn't let that happen." Then Rachel turned back to the judge, stared straight ahead, and fell silent. The sentence. The sentence came swiftly, and it was unforgiving. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. The room buzzed with murmurs, a mix of disbelief and satisfaction. Some considered it harsh, others believed it was only fitting for a crime so brutal. The sight of Rachel being led out of the courtroom in cuffs became the final image that defined the trial. A mother, broken, resigned to her fate. "She got what she deserved," muttered one man from the gallery as the courtroom emptied. But not everyone agreed. Justice, many believed, had failed to account for the nuances of Rachel's story. Emily's fate. In the aftermath of Rachel's sentencing, the focus shifted to Emily, who had been placed in the custody of Child Protective Services shortly after her mother's arrest. The young girl, now 7 years old, was a silent, withdrawn figure in every photo released by the state. By all accounts, she hardly spoke in the weeks following her removal from the only home she had ever known. "She's a sweet child," said one of her foster care coordinators in a later interview, "but you can tell she's carrying something heavy. She has nightmares sometimes, wakes up crying for her mom." Efforts to find a permanent adoptive family for Emily began immediately, but her notoriety and the media circus surrounding the case created complications. Who would be willing to take in the daughter of a killer? In the meantime, Emily's stuffed bunny, a faded floppy-eared toy that had been clutched tightly in her mother's suitcase during their escape, became her constant companion. It was the only link she had to a past she was too young to fully comprehend. The debate that wouldn't die. Rachel's case divided the country. Activists for domestic violence survivors rallied around her, arguing that Rachel was more than a criminal. She was a victim who had been let down by society, by law enforcement, by everyone who had ignored the signs of abuse. "She shouldn't have been in that situation to begin with," said Karen Daniels, chair of the Domestic Violence Advocacy League, in an impassioned interview on national news. "We hear these stories all the time, women calling out for help, being ignored, and then they're forced to take matters into their own hands. Was Rachel more guilty of a crime? Absolutely. But where were the cops when Jake Ford was terrorizing her? Where were the courts when he used their child as leverage against her?" Opponents, however, were equally vocal. "Rachel Moore made a choice," ADA Monica Ruiz said during an interview following the trial. "She chose violence, and while I understand the sympathy, we cannot build a society that excuses murder based on subjective emotions or personal circumstances. No one has the right to decide who lives or dies." Reflections from Drake and Carter. Back at the precinct, Detective Michael Drake and Officer Melissa Carter found themselves grappling with the case's ripples even after the trial ended. "You think she deserved life?" Melissa asked one night as the two of them sat across from each other at their desks, finishing late paperwork. Drake exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Deserved? I don't know. Maybe. What I do know is that 16 stab wounds aren't something you just wave away with a sad backstory. People don't get to play judge, jury, and executioner, not even Rachel Moore." "But it's not that black and white," Melissa pressed. "What about the system? The red flags we missed? She was stuck in a nightmare and we gave her no way out. What was she supposed to do, Mike? Just wait until Jake made good on his threats, until he hurt Emily, or worse?" Drake shook his head. "You're not wrong," he admitted. "The system failed her. Hell, we failed her. But here's the thing. What happens when we start letting people decide, on their own, that murder's their only option? The second we cross that line, we lose the very system we're trying to fix." For a long moment they sat in silence, the weight of the case still hanging over them like a shadow neither could escape. The legacy of Apartment 8. Years later, the events at Greenpoint Towers would still be whispered about, the stench that first alerted the neighbors, the steel drum, the desperate escape. Rachel Moore's story would live on as both a cautionary tale and a controversial debate. Could society have saved her before it was too late? Or was she always destined to become a headline, a victim turned perpetrator in a tragic cycle of violence? And as the years blurred the details of the case, only one thing remained clear. Emily, no matter who raised her or where she lived, would never escape the legacy of Apartment 8B.